I'm on the phone with Brian Oliver, who was the director of animation at Kids WB back in the day. And just so you know what that means, he didn't necessarily work on any particular show, but what he did actually is he produced a lot of the bumpers and interstitials that you would see during commercial breaks in the network, as well as a few other things that we'll talk about possibly. In any case, Brian, why don't you start? Where are you from? And sort of how did you get into video production as a job?
Well, I'm originally from Kentucky. I grew up in northern Kentucky. Went to college at a small Catholic college back in northern Kentucky, studying computer science and art. They didn't have a computer animation degree at that time because, frankly, in the 80s, computer animation was so nascent that it just didn't exist. It was too expensive. You had to have a supercomputer to do it. I was very much interested in effects, visual effects. Star Wars changed my life, like every kid on the planet. I wanted to move to Hollywood and do special effects. And ultimately, somehow managed to kind of pull it off. Moved to Los Angeles in 1989, right out of college, and started doing work for Disney. I did restoration work on 3 movies for Disney: Cinderella, Pinocchio, and Bambi. I was doing court cases. I recreated auto accidents for a while, learning 3D. And then in 96, I was contacted by a friend who said, Kids WB, Warner Brothers Network, they need people that can do compositing and animation. You should look into it. So I hit up a couple of people and got an interview, and suddenly I was freelancing and building logos and whatnot, and moved all the way up to director, and I've been here for 20 years now.
Yeah, we'll get into some of your more modern work in a little bit, but let's talk about some of those bumpers and other segments. First of all, there were a ton of these, and they usually involve various characters from the various shows. Sometimes they would even have different characters from different shows, or even new audio that had to be recorded. Can you sort of briefly describe what the process was going from sort of initial idea to a produced segment?
Sure. Normally, back in those days, we had 3 main people on the development, which would be a writer-producer, who was the same person, and his or her editor, and then somebody like me on the graphic side, where we would have to figure out, if we could accomplish what they were asking for. They'd come up with some wacky idea where they wanted Ash or, a character from Batman or something interacting together, and we'd have to find that footage in the existing animations of the shows. We digitize it, and then we would trace the characters frame by frame to isolate them and put them into different environments so we could get them to talk to each other. Then we had people like Rob Paulson and Maurice and Sherry Stoner, all the Animaniacs, the different voices. Mark Hamill came in a couple of times to do Joker voiceovers for us. They'd come in, they'd record the audio of the scripts, we'd marry it up with the video, and there you go.
How many people hours do you think one of these would take on average? Obviously depend on the level of production, but on average, what do you think?
Well, something like the Pokemon Master song that we're going to get into in a bit, like I said on my YouTube channel, that's about 80 hours of me all by myself, just cranking. And then adding on to that, the amount of time it took for a designer to do the front end and the back end. On an average spot, though, like our average, what we would call a campaign, there might be between probably 4 or 5 people on the managerial side of it, producer, executive producer types, and then anywhere from, 1 to 10 different animators dealing with it, just depending. I mean, I've had some campaigns where we spent thousands of hours on it, and then other campaigns where you just kind of crank it out really fast. It just depends on the deadline.
What are some of the more interesting or some of your favorite ones that you worked on?
Oh, anything with the sock, with the Kids WB sock. I don't know if you guys remember that, but I didn't create the character. A really talented writer named Ryan Sage created the character. I created the design of the character, and then all the animation. So the sock had a summer party at one point on the beach. I think it was called Surf's Up with the sock, and then we had a couple of Christmas parties. And it was just this filthy tube sock that would interact with all of our characters. It was really funny. I mean, people got a kick out of it. And some of the spots, I actually, my kids were between like 5 and 10 at that time. So I was actually able to incorporate my own children into some of our spots, which was a lot of fun. And some of their friends, too, for that matter. I'd round up a bunch of kids and have them come in, and we'd shoot them like either for their mouth motions or, get their voices, and then integrate that into the cartoons as well.
Really awesome when you can do stuff like that.
Oh yeah, it was great.
And it seems like, from what we discussed earlier before the interview, that some of the Pokemon stuff was actually a little bit easier to work with than some of the other shows might have been. Why was that?
Well, as anybody who watches Pokemon probably realizes, there's not a lot of animation going on there most of the time. A normal second of animation, for cartoon animation, I should say, is 24 frames a second. For television, it's 30 frames a second. Meaning that there's 30 individual frames that comprise 1 second of what you're viewing. With Pokemon, they often would only give you 1 or 2 unique frames for every second. So it was, instead of having to trace 15 frames of animation, we would only have to trace 1, which was awesome because it was a huge time saver. And then we would go back and we'd replace the mouths and stuff to get the lip sync to look right.
Okay, well, let's talk about one of these in particular. You mentioned it earlier. It's Master Pokemon, not to be confused with anything from the To Be a Master album. This has nothing to do with that. This is this was part of a series called Top Tunes Tunes. First of all, how did that series sort of get started? There were a couple other ones, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We had a couple of Jackie Chan. We had the Mummy. I'm trying to think of what. Well, I guess it was the Mummy, but the. One of our writer-producers, and I'm trying to think of who was actually doing this stuff at that time. Forgive me for forgetting. We had like 10 people, and they were all really talented. And so they'd have somebody write a song for one of the shows, and then we would cut together an animation to make a music video out of it. And those were sometimes they were packaged and sent off as Top Tunes Tunes, but they were also repackaged as Toonami Tunes, I think it was. So you. In the later days of Kids WB, when we were doing a lot of Toonami stuff with Cartoon Network, there was a crossover where we repackaged all that stuff. But that particular one, we were getting ready to launch. Our launches in the fall were always like the first week of September. So they wanted something big. They wanted something special. Allison, the singer of that particular song, had come up with the music for it and the lyrics and all that. And they said, well, we need it. We want it for launch. And I basically had a week to produce it. And it was crazy. It was a long week. But they wanted something. And the thing that was fun about it for me was every frame from when that ball leaves Ash's hands, as soon as it leaves his hands, it actually becomes a computer-generated 3D ball that you open up and fly into. And we wanted to have, like, this interior universe of the ball and, like, what did that look like? And so we found I had, help finding all these different arenas that were in the shows themselves, and I tried to build environments where the arena, which was a 2-dimensional, cutout basically from the animation from the show, and try to put it into this 3D world so that it didn't look like it was just a piece of flat artwork. And then we had all of those characters. There were probably, I don't know how many, 30 or 40 different characters that had to be rotoed and traced and then dropped into that 3-dimensional universe. It was quite a project, but it's one of my favorite projects of all time, simply because it just went down so fast. It just had to be there. It had to be done. And I think people like it.
Oh, definitely. It is obviously somewhat obscure because it's never been like a DVD extra or anything like that, so it's been kind of hard to track down until somewhat recently, but definitely impressive and a great piece of work there.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, you're still actually in the sort of the bumper production or animation production business. People may be wondering, well, gee, what happened after the WB and the UPN merged together into the CW? Why don't you give us a little bit of an idea of what's happened since then?
Well, Kids WB actually turned into, I think it was 4Kids CW, or we maintained Kids WB for about a year or two into the CW, and then they decided they weren't going to keep that property anymore, so they ended up shutting it all down, which for me was a very massive letdown because I love cartoon animation. I love working on that kind of stuff. These days, though, I'm still doing similar work. It's just that it's more special effects driven. It's more like I do a lot of stuff like taking out wires, removing cables and stuff from shows like The Flash and Arrow and iZombie. supernatural. I mean, anything that's on the CW at this point, at some point, comes through my office for something. Generally it's cleaning up footage, removing wrinkles from people's faces, things like that. And it's gotten more challenging because we're starting to do a lot more effects type stuff, whereas it used to be more just graphics, motion graphics.
Well, yeah, it never ends. So I would say that you're probably going to keep having things to do there. But if folks want to know more about you or some of your other work, where can they look for that?
Well, they can find me in two places. My YouTube channel is Xandad, Xandad. And I noticed when you guys were talking about it on the on your music broadcast, they were kind of like, "What is it, Zan? What?" And the background of it is my son's name is Alexander, and when he was born, and I needed a video game character, I just needed to name one of my characters, and I was like, "Well, let's see, I'm Alexander's dad, so I'll be Xandad." That's how my YouTube channel came into being. But then I also have my website, which is the same thing, Xandad.com. And you can see all kinds of stuff that I'm working on there. I've got animation, I've got a lot of 3D printing, I've got some music, I've got writing, I've got photography. I do a lot of stuff.
Awesome. Love hearing these stories. This is no exception. All right. Well, thank you very much, Brian. Been great having you on.
Thanks for looking me up. I'm glad that people are paying attention.
Not a problem. This has been Stephen Reich from the Pokepress Studios in Madison, Wisconsin, talking to Brian Oliver, who worked on many of the bumpers of Kids WB back in the day.